Hi, everyone. This week's topic is related to positioning and perceptual maps. Uh, Perception in the minds of the consumer is very, very important. And we are going to see that in the form of a social experiment. So I want you to take a look at this video on Payless experiment. What they've done in this social experiment is that Payless shoes, which is typically known for, very low priced shoes, they created the store of with items in the store and the store design, which kind of exuded a very the looks of a luxury store. And they placed the same Payless shoes with a new label called Palesi. And they invited the influencers to come try their shoes, buy their shoes, and the same shoes that were typically $30 in Payless store were priced at around $300 and in the Palesi store and sold to the influencers. But of course, they did an interview of the influencers, asking them about the quality of the shoe, whether the price justified the quality, etc., etc. And later, they disclosed to the influencers that this was a fake brand that Payless had created, and the shoes were actually Payless shoes, much to the surprise of the influencers. But the idea of this whole experiment was to change the perception of the influencers that luxury items are high priced. And the point of the story is that perception of the consumers about products is very, very important, and it determines their willingness to pay for a product. So in this lecture, we are going to look at how can firms change the perceptions of the consumers, or how they can use the perception of the consumers for their product attributes to design better products or reposition the products. So here's an example that we covered in the clustering class. This is an example on segmentation and for carpet fibers. So there are two attributes which are very important for carpet fibers. One is the strength, and the other one is water resistance. So this shows that there are 4 segments that have been highlighted, and the segment A perceives the product to have high strength but low water resistance. And segment D perceives the product to have high strength and high water resistance. And C perceives the carpet fiber to have high water resistance and low strength. So when you find these kind of distinct segments in the market, and let's say this particular brand is currently targeting this particular segment A, but would like to move into segment D. So in other words, they need to reposition their brand to target the customers or the consumers in segment T. So what is it that the brand needs to do to be able to reach out to the consumers in segment D? So should they increase the quality or the water resistance of the carpet fibers and reposition the brand, and how can they do it successfully? So that is an example of perception, right? Perception mapping. So once the brand has identified the segments, it's important to target the segment, select a particular segment for targeting, to look at the competitors, the number of competitors in the segment, to see how the brand fares relative to those competitors, and whether a particular segment is worth targeting, whether it'll result in the return on investments that the product or the brand plans to invest in reaching out to the consumers. So after having taken into account all of these factors, the number of competitors, the attributes, and how the product competes with the competing products, the number of consumers in the segment, etc., the brand comes up with what we call as the positioning statement. And that positioning statement tries to differentiate the focal brand from the other competing brands. So that is the key part of selecting a segment to target it and then creating a positioning statement. So how can you come up with these with a positioning statement? Let's take a look in the further slides. So when we take a brand wants to position against competitor brands and reach out to the consumers in that particular segment, there are two things that the brand needs to do. The first is differentiation. What you do to an offering. So what are the tangible or intangible attributes between your offering that differ from the main competitor offering? So that is the key point of differentiation. How are you able to differentiate your product from the existing competitors? Then having determined your differentiation, then the brand has to design a positioning statement to indicate to the consumers that what you are trying to do and how you stand out from the other competitors, so that the consumers are able to perceive very clearly how your brand stands out in the existing set of offerings. So it is positioning is a set of strategies that a firm develops to differentiate its offering in the minds of target consumers. So successful positioning will result in offering occupying a distinct, important, sustainable position in the minds of target consumers. So let's take a look at the example. Let's consider the brand Lush. Lush has grown significantly in the market to gain substantial market share from the competitors Sephora, Mecca, etc. So Lush competes with these brands in differentiating itself by indicating to consumers that the Lush products are handmade products as compared to the other products. So it is very sustainable. It is very clean. The products are very clean. They are very good for the skin, and they are most of all handmade. So that is a key differentiation strategy used by Lush compared to the other competitors. And the way that Lush positions itself in the market is by reaching out to the consumers and creating the perception that Lush appeals to the girl who's had enough and believes in ethical buying. So that is a key point of differentiation for Lush. Now, the researchers Urbani and Davis came up with the 3 circles strategy to create positioning for a brand. And this article was published in Harvard Business Review and is pretty popular. And it came out in 2007 and is still relevant as of today. So now what does this 3 circles insight tells us? So the 3 circles stand for the company's offerings, the competitors' offerings, and the customer needs. So the brand has to identify the customer needs that can be fulfilled by the company's offerings. That is this part A, right? So you have to identify what are those important aspects of your attributes which help to fulfill customer needs which are not being fulfilled by the competitor. Then it is important to identify what are the points of difference in the competitor's offerings which are satisfying the customer needs, but your product is not supplying those. So it is important to identify how different you are from the competitor and how much you can differentiate your products compared to the competitors' products. But of course, there's always going to be an overlap. So both the company's offerings and the competitors' offerings will have a certain overlap in the amount of, to the extent to which they fulfill the customer's needs. So there are some points, there are some requirements which the customers have that can be fulfilled by both the competitors. And so identifying these differences becomes the important factor. Now, when firms are positioning, when firms are looking for opportunities, this area in the circle, which is marked as E, is the white space. These are the customer needs that are not fulfilled, right? So this is where a lot of opportunity lies. So it is important to understand your customers, what needs of the customers remain unfulfilled, and can you design your products? Can you bring out new variants for the products that can fulfill those needs? Now, on the other hand, there are these areas, that is F, D, and G. These are the companies or the competitors' offerings or the common features between the competitor and the focal brand's offerings, but they do not fulfill customer needs. So these are irrelevant areas and need not be focused on, right? So these are some of the key points to remember. So it is not only your point of differentiation, but you also have to take into account what the customer offerings are. So the point of difference are the unique aspects of the products that consumers desire and the company can provide, but the competitors do not provide that. So that is the purpose of the three circles, to be able to identify what are your points of difference of your product from that of other products. So that is able to help you identify the value that your product can offer and turn the actual value into perceived value. So consider, for example, a hair dryer. So Dyson is pretty popular in the market right now. Why Dyson is popular? It's because Dyson fulfills the consumer needs for gentle heating, right? So this is the consumer need which is being fulfilled by Dyson, but all the other competitors, so it is their point of difference, that is using low heat. But for all the competitors which are also offering, which the common points, that is they dry the hair, but they have relatively high heat settings on their dryers. So when Dyson reaches out to the consumers, their products are premium priced, and they are doing the premium pricing based on the fact that the key point of difference is that their products are gentle on the hair and they do not harm the hair. So it's a price worth paying for. So the general positioning options are like, for example, you can position your product as being very unique. That is, you're the only supplier offering that true packaging or, the product or fulfilling that unique need. It can be superior in terms of quality of the product or in terms of, other attributes such as delivery services, time to reach the destination, etc. So some aspect of your service or your product that is superior relative to the competition. Or it could be equal but cheaper. So you're selling the same quality but at a cheaper price. So for example, Hyundai has the impression that compared to Toyota and Honda, Hyundai quality is the same, but it comes at a much lower price. So they are able to beat the competitor's price to provide greater value for money. So these are some of the ways that firms can position their products. Okay, So now let's take a look at some of the positioning statements. So here are 3 examples. JCPenney is a retail store. So JCPenney is a retail store in the US. Pantene is a brand that most of us are very familiar with. It's a shampoo brand. And Microsoft.net, Microsoft is a company that is into production of several ID products. So let's take a look at the example of Pantene, which their positioning statement. So Pantene is for females 18 to 49 years of age who possess dry, damaged hair and believe they cannot truly achieve healthy, shiny hair. So Pantene is a hair care system, shampoo, conditioner, styling aids that offers hair so healthy that it shines because it penetrates from the root to the tip through its patented Pro-Vitamin B5 formula. So here is the differentiation. So Pantene is differentiating itself from the other companies, competitors, by indicating very clearly that they have a special formula that is patented, and it's a Pro-Vitamin B5 formula. And their target customers are females in the age of 18 to 49. And the problem faced by these customers, or the unique need of these customers, is a solution for dry, damaged hair. So it's a very clear positioning statement where the target segment is well known, the problem or the need of that segment is well known, and how Pantene fulfills that need and differentiates itself from the customers, from the other competitors. Okay, so some other examples of successful positioning themes are given here. For example, Apple iPod positions itself as storing about 1,000 songs, BMW with exceptional performance. Burger King, positions itself as on the basis of personalization, have it your way. Charmin tissue, softness, Coke, authentic, real, and original. So these are some of the examples of positioning statements. Disney as wholesome family entertainment. So one has to be very clear about when you are creating these positioning statements, they have to have very, very clear differentiation from the competitors. So here's an example of Charmin ad that you would see, that it is so much softer that you will not be able to keep your paws of it. So it very clearly indicates the key attribute that it is emphasizing. It is so much more softer that you can feel the difference, right? And Mitsubishi indicates its differentiation for its products by talking about the Hyper DRAM process technology, which is a unique technology which has helped Mitsubishi to ship more embedded DRAM than all the other suppliers combined. So this is indicating the superiority of their service compared to other competitors because of a specialized technology that they are using. Okay, here's an example of Hertz, which says that if you're not in the car, you're reserved, you're really not in the driver's seat. So they are emphasizing on their prestige collection, reserve the exact luxury car of your choice. So that is a differentiation. You can have the car of your choice versus the other competitors, where if you're booking a car, you just take what you get. And here's another example of the brand Flonase. It is, one of the allergy medicines, and they have done a comparison of how Flonase addresses so many needs for the pets. For example, pollen, pet dander, dust mites, pollution, smoke, strong odors, and compared how Flonase compares to Nasonex, Zyrtec, Claritin, and Allegra. So it's an allergic, if you're a person with allergies and you suffer from seasonal allergies, you suffer from pet allergies, pollution, etc., then they've done a clear comparison of why you should opt for Flonase because it addresses so many more allergies compared to the other products. However, at this point, there's one thing to note that comparative advertising is legal in some countries and illegal in other countries. So it just depends on where this company is located. For example, this one seems to be, this is an ad from the US based company. Okay, so this is an ad based in the US. All right. So the different steps to positioning. The first step is you are going to select your target segment. You're going to determine the relative competitive offerings. So what is it that, what is your offering and how it, fares with the competitor? You're going to determine the potential differentiator dimensions. How can you potentially differentiate it from the competitor products? You're going to select a sample of consumers in the target segment and get ratings of the competitors on the selected dimensions. So something that you are doing in your conjoint projects, right? So the perception, the preference ratings that you are collecting can be used to create positioning statements. So once you have obtained these ratings, you can create what we call as perceptual maps. You can create the maps. Say this is a dimension of high quality versus low quality. So this is quality, and let's say this is design or price. So you can identify the main dimensions on which you want to plot the different brands, and then check for yourself how you would like to position your brand among the existing brands. So relate to the preference, choice, or market share. You relate these maps or the results to consumer preference or choice or market share, whatever you have. And then you develop a positioning statement and associated strategies. Okay, so now let us talk about perceptual maps. Perceptual maps are a visual representation of the perceptions of the customers or potential customers generally about specific attributes of an organization, a product, or a service, etc. So for example, what you have here on the slide is a perceptual map of consumers who have indicated how they perceive the different brands on two dimensions. One is financial effectiveness, the other one is prestige. So if you look at this map, you will notice that the financial effectiveness goes on this end is high, on this end is low. And prestige, again, on this end is high and on the other end is low. So if you look at cars like Mercedes, BMW, these are high on the prestige. They're also high on the financial effectiveness, but here we don't know what the definition of financial effectiveness is. These are more expensive cars because you pay a premium to get these cars, but probably financial effectiveness could be the effectiveness of holding on to the car in the long run for a certain period of time. So this is the perception of the customers on the basis of the prestige and financial effectiveness. And then firms like Jaguar, Toyota, these are low on prestige, but they're very high on what you can say on financial effectiveness. Not exactly low, but they are somewhere in the middle of as far as prestige is concerned. On the other hand, if you look at Honda and Volvo, these are relatively on the higher end of the spectrum as far as prestige is concerned. and they are somewhere towards the low end of financial effectiveness in the spectrum. So you can clearly see that the cars can be positioned very distinctly. There are segments of cars that that consumers perceive as being prestigious, and there are other segments of cars which are high on financial effectiveness. So if you are introducing a new car brand in the market, then a perceptual map gives you a very good clue, a good idea as to what the current competitive environment is and where should you want to position your product. So in other words, these perceptual maps, they are very useful to understand the behavior of the customers, and scan the environment. So the first type of map is what we call as the determinant map. Now, a determinant map is based on the expert's judgment. So as a marketer, if I take all the competitors in the market for cars and I plot them on the two most important dimensions that I'm considering in terms of creating a strategy, then that is called as a determinant map. It's a visual map, but it's created by the marketer. For example, I want to have one of the dimensions as price, and the other dimension is, let's say, performance, because as a marketer, when we are developing products, these are two very important dimensions for designing cars. So if I plot the competitors, let's say BMW, it's high on performance, high on price, and then I will get something what we call as determinant map. So I can plot all different competitors here and then look at how I would like to design the new product or new variant of car before launching it into the market, so as we can differentiate it the most and come up with a positioning statement for that product. So that is a determinant map. So this is the keyword. It is drawn by the marketers or experts themselves. The second is the most commonly used perceptual map, and that is the attribute-based perceptual map. Here, it is not the marketer, but it is the customers who will give you their ratings, preference ratings, and those preference ratings are actually used to create the perceptual map. So it is the perceptions of the customers, and that is why we call it as the attribute-based perceptual map. So we ask the customers to tell us what attributes they believe the products have, how they view those attributes. So for example, just exactly what you're doing in your conjoint task, you are asking the question of, please indicate your preference for the different designs on a scale of 1 to 7 or on a scale of 1 to 10. So that those ratings that you're obtaining in the conjoint reflect the market perception about the product. So once you have obtained those ratings, then you can take two attributes at a time and you can plot those attributes on X and Y axis and create what is called as a positioning map. So you'll see that in the tutorial related video. And so for example, let's say, again, for soft drinks market, for example, you are looking at two dimensions. Health is one dimension and taste is another dimension, right? So what you can do is you have the customers and they are ranked from 1 to 3 and so on up to 50. So 50 customers give you their preference ratings on health and taste for Coke, health and taste for Pepsi. Let's say this is for Coke. So you have gotten those preference rankings, say 5, 7, 6. So across all the customers, you take an average across all the customers. Okay. And let's say the average rating on health for Coke is 2, on taste is 5. Same way for the average rating for Pepsi on, let's say, health is, I'll just write H for health and T for taste. So the average rating that 50 customers have given to Pepsi on health is, let's say, 3, and on taste it is 4. So you can plot these two dimensions, health and taste, and see how Coke and Pepsi stand as far as consumers are concerned. So I'm just giving you an example of 2 brands, but when you have many competitors and you're doing a conjoint study of, let's say, 2, 3 competitors, or you are doing a conjoint study of these 2 competitors and trying to introduce a new soft drink brand, then plotting the brands on these various different dimensions helps you to gain insights as to what attributes consumers value when they are consuming soft drinks. And in general, it also helps a marketer to understand or gain insights into the competitors' products. And that helps you to design and differentiate your products, to identify the gaps in the market, etc. So perceptual maps, attribute-based perceptual maps are a great tool to scan the environment before you design your marketing, branding, and positioning strategies. Okay, so here's an example of how the industry uses. This is a more complicated perceptual map. This is by Gartner. Gartner is a very well-known market research firm that collects a lot of market intelligence and data. So this is a magic quadrant for analytics and BI platforms. So the key point to understand here is what they have done is they have identified 2 dimensions. So the consumers were asked to rate the different companies based on several factors or criteria. For example, the product or service overall viability, marketing execution, customer experience, marketing strategy, sales strategy, innovation, geographic strategy, etc. Now that was more than 2 attributes. So it's very difficult to plot more than 2 attributes on us on the same graph. It becomes really complicated. So this is a more complex type of perceptual map where they combined, where they reduced all these dimensions to just 2 attributes, and they are the ability to execute. That is one dimension, which includes these 7 criteria or attributes: product and service, viability, execution, etc. And the second dimension is the completeness of vision. That's the second dimension. And that includes the strategy, marketing strategy, sales strategy, innovation, geographical strategy, etc. And using these, after having reduced the various different attributes to just 2 dimensions, then these competitors were plotted on this 2-dimensional scale. And what resulted in was these 4 different segments in which the companies were playing and how they were perceived as. So some were perceived as leaders like Microsoft, Tableau. The others were perceived as visionaries, which included SAS and Oracle and others, SAP and other companies. Then there were the challengers, that is the MicroStrategy, Google, Domo, and then there are the niche players, which included Amazon services, Alibaba, and other companies. So this is a very, so it doesn't matter how many attributes you are, checking with the consumers, but that is the ability. You are able to reduce these dimensions to just 2 dimensions, and that is a good part. So it's a very powerful tool, very useful tool. All right. So the example of Gartner comes under what we call as the principal components analysis. So principal components is a more complicated technique of perceptual mapping, where you find common factors for multiple attributes, or in other words, we call it as a dimension reduction technique, where multiple attributes are reduced to just 2 dimensions. Beyond this, we don't need to get into the technicality, and to be able to do a principal components analysis, we need statistical software like SAS, SPSS, R. In R, you have to write codes, but SPSS and SAS will be able to, do the principal components analysis at just the click of a very basic command. So here's an example. So the procedure for principal components analysis is just the same as you're doing in your conjoint analysis. You ask the respondents about the perceptions of each brand on a few attributes using 5, 7, or 10-point scales. So you, as students for your projects, are also using 5, 7, or 10-point scales. So, and you ask the question in similar manner, please rate the following for office equipment providers on 5 attributes, 1 being very poor and 7 being very good. So these are the attributes given over here. Once you collect the data from, let's say you have 100 consumers for each of these companies, then you take an average of each of these attribute ratings across the 100 consumers, and you can reduce that then to the average 2 dimensions and be able to look at perceptual maps. Now, if you are, let's say for some reason, if you've not collected the data on, these attributes, what is another way that you can create perceptual maps is by collecting the data from review websites. So let's say you're comparing hotels and you are, let's say, comparing 4 to 5 hotels, then you could go to product review websites such as TripAdvisor for hotels, and you can collect the average ratings. So the good part is the average ratings are given over there on different dimensions. For example, location of the hotel, cleanliness, service, value. All these are attributes, and you can, and there is the overall average rating as well. So you can take the average for location, cleanliness, service, and value, and either do 2 by 2 Excel graphs to look at the different dimensions, how the brands compare, or you could do a principal components analysis if you have lots of data points and reduce the different dimensions to be able to create a perceptual map. So principal components analysis is beyond the scope of the subject, but that's the basic idea, or the motivation is, or the intuition is something that I've told you about. So you collect the data, you calculate the average ratings, and then you feed it into the software, and that will reduce the different dimensions into just 2 dimensions. Okay, so this is an example of the R code, the R package that you need to write a little code if you want to do principal components analysis. All right. Now here is the output of the principal components analysis. So it has taken the different, the different attributes and reduced these attributes into 2 dimensions. So for these different companies. So let's take a look and see what is important. So dimension 2. So it's important to see what principal component analysis indicates. So PCA tells you that dimension 1 helps to explain 66.9% variation in the data, and dimension 2 explains around 31% variation in the data. So taken together, these 2 dimensions are able to explain about 98% of the variation in data. So it's a very high percentage that can be explained on the basis of the 2 dimensions, which indicates that all of the different attributes have been reduced very well into these two dimensions. And the attributes in dimension 1 are highly correlated, and the attributes in dimension 2 are highly correlated. So for example, dimension 2 is highly correlated to convenience, whereas dimension 1, an important attribute is service quality, and it is highly, service quality and product quality, which are very highly correlated with dimension 1 or are a part of dimension 1. So now, on the basis of this perceptual PCA analysis, this perceptual map has been created. And now if you look at this perceptual map is giving you some additional info. So it is plotting out the different dimensions also. For example, this is the dimension of product quality. The direction of the arrow indicates that the product quality is increasing towards descent. Convenience is increasing towards descent. Service quality on this end. So the direction of the arrow indicates that the attribute importance is increasing in that direction. So there are two things to note here. One is that because, you can look at the distance between the two brands. For example, Office Equipment and Office Star. So that is one. The distance between the two brands, if it is large, indicates substantial differentiation between the two brands, right? The other thing is, if you want to see how each of the brand fares on these individual dimensions, what you do is you take a perpendicular distance. So for example, this is where Office Equipment is on product quality. But if you take perpendicular distance for Office Star, this is where it is on product quality, which indicates that Office Star definitely has higher quality compared to Office Equipment. And in terms of choice, again, if you plot a perpendicular line from Office Star to Choice and from Office Equipment to Choice, and we know that as you go towards the direction of the arrow, the attribute importance increases, which means that Office Star offers larger choices, or it carries broader, bigger inventory. So there's more choice for consumers as compared to Office Equipment. So this is a way that you would, compare the brands. So on convenience, if you compare Office Equipment to supermarkets, so this is where Office Equipment lies, and this is where supermarket lies if you draw the perpendicular distance. So clearly, supermarket offers more convenience to consumers as compared to Office Equipment. Right? So these are some of the ways that you can look at the brands, understand how the brands are performing on different dimensions on using the principal components analysis. So it is more sophisticated as compared to just plotting two dimensions, but you need the use of a statistical software. And this is what we just saw. So you can look at the distance between the two brands to see how similar or differentiated they are. And you can look at the perpendicular distance of the brands on an attribute to determine how they compare with one another. All right. There's another mapping, which is called a similarity-based mapping. Now, again, this is a very complicated, it's a more complex form compared to the basic attribute-based, perceptual mapping. So just similar to PCA analysis, it is more complex. So instead of asking very specific about ratings of attributes, here we ask the consumers to indicate directly the similarity between pairs of alternatives. So rate the following pairs of brands on their similarity. 1 is very similar and 7 is very dissimilar. This output is then taken and plotted on the maps to be able to come up with perceptual dimensions. Now, here's an example of multidimensional scaling. This was a study by Nedza et al. 2012. This is a research study. What they did was they studied the reviews of the different cars. And the premise was that if a review talks about a car, let's say Mazda, but also mentions Honda in the same review, then that means that Mazda and Honda are close competitors. And this is what they set out to show in this study. They studied all the reviews of the cars and then plotted all the brands of the cars that were discussed together in the reviews by using multidimensional scaling. So this is what it revealed, that there were 3 segments of cars. So for example, when a customer was giving a review for Mercedes, they tend to probably talk about some of these brands. Similarly, if consumers are giving reviews of Honda, Nissan, or Toyota, they will then discuss, more likely to discuss the other Japanese and Korean brands because these compete with one another. So there are clear segments of cars which are perceived as competitors by the consumers. So here's the slide that talks about the comparison of the different perceptual maps. For the determinant maps, that is the first type of maps that we saw, these maps are plotted by the managers or the marketeers or the experts. But the other types of perceptual maps, the AR perceptual map is based on, that is the attribute-based maps, are based on the customer's ratings on specific attributes. OS, perceptual maps, that is similarity perceptual maps, are based on the similarity ratings for 2 brands or 2 dimensions given by the consumers. Now, for this determinant map, it's a simple map and can be plotted on 2 dimensions, but the other 2 techniques require dimension reduction. So that is, you use factor analysis or principal components analysis and multidimensional scaling for similarities, okay? And the graphical output, of course, are different types of maps. These are multidimensional maps in both the cases. This is a 2-dimensional map. And the usage is, they are, determinant maps are quick and cost efficient because you're doing it at the company level. The other types of perceptual maps are important. So you ask the consumers to rate when the attributes are very easily articulated. But if they are difficult, then you would use what we call a similarity rating. So the concept, the overall idea is that it's easier for consumers to rate 2 brands, compare the 2 brands as to how similar or different they are, compared to rating their attributes, okay? And of course, the challenges are that these are purely judgmental. The determinant maps and perceptual maps are based on how well you can identify the attributes and the factors, and the different dimensions. Okay, here's an example of another perceptual map, which is called as a joint space map. Now, this is a little different from the other maps because here the perception ratings of the brands have been plotted. So for example, Budweiser, Beck's, how they rate on the dimensions premium and heavy or light beer, right? So the brands have been rated based on the attribute ratings given by the consumers and as well as the individual consumers' ideal points. So that is the key to remember. So this is what you call as ideal point for this specific consumer. So what does that mean? So the ideal point means while the brands are, for example, Budweiser is higher on the heavy side of the beer and it's a premium beer in this particular segment, but this consumer's ideal point is this, that they would like a premium beer. This consumer would like a premium beer, which is not as heavy, would be slightly less heavy, if we can call it. For this consumer, they are clearly out for a premium beer, but more, relatively less heavy, if we can call it, to lower on the heavy scale. So this is how it helps you to see plotting the brands and the consumer's ideal points together helps you to identify the segments. So I want you to see how many segments there are, how many you can see. It's actually mentioned over there. You can also, if you try to spot these segments, you can see which segment of consumers prefer what brands of beers. And if you want to, let's say here is this particular segment. So if you identify a big group of customers whose needs are unfulfilled, then you can probably try and develop a product to position in that particular segment if it is attractive. So that's how plotting the brands and the customers' ideal points on the same map can be very useful. So here's another one. It's a more complicated perceptual map. This is again a research study on wines done by Moon and Kamakura 2016. And what they looked at was wine attributes, and they have plotted in this perceptual map the wine attributes and the brands discussed. So it's much more complicated and hard to interpret. Okay, so there are two types of preference representation, the ones that we just saw. One is the ideal point of the customer on a particular attributes. For example, the attribute can be sweetness and their preference for a brand. The other is the vector preference model. That is, you are plotting the individual, you're able to spot how far the brands are on a particular attribute by drawing a perpendicular line. So both have their own advantages, and it depends on the situation, what you're trying to do. And based on that, if you're trying to enter a totally new market, you're trying to cater to demand, unfulfilled demand for a niche group of consumers, then probably the ideal point preference model in the joint space would be a great way. If you want to reposition your map, your brand, then probably a vector preference model based on PCA analysis would be helpful. So it just depends on the context in which you want to apply. All right, now, given that you have identified your target segment from the different clusters of consumers that exist in the market, you have identified how the brands are positioned in terms of the consumer's perception. Knowing that information can help the brands to create different types of, like I mentioned, marketing, branding, and positioning strategies. So if you are trying to design a new product and want to reposition your brand or move your existing product, for example, in the case of Payless, change the perceptions of the consumers, you need to reposition your product in the consumer's mind. Then we focus on what are called as the repositioning strategies. So let's talk about those. So repositioning, as I mentioned before, it is essentially moving the position of the brand in the consumer's mind. So how do we go about with repositioning a brand? So here's an example of Hyundai, how they reposition their brand in the European market. So take a look at this article. It's a very interesting article. I will just give you the basis of the story. So essentially, Hyundai is well known as a value for money brand. But when they entered the European market, the brand was doing very well. And in fact, there was a time when the other competitors' sales were low, but Hyundai continued to perform. And at the same time, the market for electric cars was opening up. So a challenge for Hyundai was how to reposition themselves, given that they have a very, product-driven approach and positioning in the minds of the consumers as being a value for money brand. And that would not essentially hold in the new market for electric cars, which were comparatively more expensive. And so the whole story about Hyundai is how it, repositioned itself in the minds of the consumers by moving from product-driven communication to more brand-driven communication by creating more awareness around the brand, as far as it being just a value for money brand, and moving it from that perception to being an emotional and mature brand, creating a connect with the consumers and positioning it as a progressive brand. So I want you to take a look at this particular case study and then try and identify the answers to the question, how is Hyundai trying to shake its perception and what do they emphasize? All right, here's another example of Gillette's evolutionary brand repositioning. So Gillette, as a company, started by manufacturing, Gillette as a brand, sorry, started by manufacturing the razor products. And then as the time went by and Gillette razors became popular, it moved on to men's skin, to repositioning itself to as a men's skincare company by designing products which were, for men, skincare products. So it repositioned itself as a total skincare solution for men. Now, how do brands reposition themselves? What kind of strategies do they follow? The most common strategy and workable strategy that the brands use is called as the blue ocean strategy. What the brands do is instead of competing in a market which is full of competitors, that is the red ocean. So you can see several sharks here competing for food. So instead of exploiting existing demand, what the brands try to do is to fulfill the unfulfilled demand by creating and capturing that new demand. So in the red ocean strategy, while the brands tend to emphasize the value cost trade-off, and make money off that by differentiating themselves either on the value or low cost. But here in the blue ocean strategy, the brands tend to break the value cost trade-off. So they differentiate, and at the same time, they offer products at a relatively low price as well. So how do you go about repositioning the products? Well, the brands might not do all of the three things, but it is essentially about understanding, what are the needs, unfulfilled needs of the consumers in that little niche or in the new market, or how can you create a new market with no competition? So to be able to follow the blue ocean strategy requires a certain number of steps. So for example, here we come back to the 3-circle insight strategy model, which essentially emphasizes looking at the company's offering, the competitors' offerings, and the customer's need. So in the blue ocean strategy, we essentially highlight this part of the circle where we are looking at customers' needs in more granular details. So one of the first steps is to eliminate. So what do you eliminate? You eliminate the factors that the industry takes for granted. That means every competitor is talking about certain product attributes which you eliminate and do not talk about. The other step is to reduce. So what factors can be reduced well below the industry standard? What are the attributes that you can emphasize less as compared to the competitors? The whole idea is to get the consumers to perceive your brand as being very different, right? Then what can you create? What is this something new about the attributes in your product that you can create, which the industry has never offered before? What can you highlight, or what is that differentiating point of difference that you can emphasize upon? And finally, what are the factors that should be raised well above the industry standard, and that again that you can use to emphasize to the consumers how you are different, right? So all of these steps, that is elimination, reduction, creation, and raising the standards, help you to reposition the product by creating value. That is called as the new value curve. So here's an example. It's rather a pretty famous example of Yellowtail wine brand when it entered the US markets. So when Yellowtail entered the market, it faced sufficient competition, pretty fierce competition in the wine market, because there were several competitors competing for the different types of wines. There were lots of varieties of wines that were offered in the American market. So what they did was they studied the market and found out that most of the competitors were talking about, their wines growing in very prestigious vineyards, and they were talking about the aging process of the wine, how the wines were carefully produced after this very complicated aging process of the wines. Because this aging process of the wines was talked about by every other competitor, so Yellowtail decided to eliminate this factor and decided not to talk about it. And furthermore, they also reduced the complicated terminology. So when they studied the actual packaging of the wine bottles, they found that the wine bottles had too much information about wines, the constituents, which the consumers actually found very, very difficult to understand. So what they did was that they did away with all that complicated terminology and introduced these very simple labels indicating the type of wine and very simple logo and design, which was very easy to discern and recognize for the consumers. So complicated terminology was something that they reduced. What did they create? They created a drink. They decided to create a flavor that was different from all the other flavors, and their wine was relatively sweeter compared to the competitors, and it appealed to the masses. So the demand for this particular wine, as positioned more on the sweeter side, increased, and it took away a substantial market share from consumers who were drinking apple ciders or beers, etc. And what did they raise well above the industry standard? They raised the simplicity of offerings. So there were just choice was too complicated in the wine market. And so they decided to come down with just two varieties, one red wine and one white wine. So in that, they came up with the different types in the red wines and the white wines. So this blue ocean strategy clearly helped this brand to perform really well in the US markets, and Yellowtail is a very well-established brand in the market now. All right, so that's about the blue ocean strategy. So the uses of mapping, essentially perceptual mapping, helps to create the perceptions that the consumers have in mind regarding your brand and the competitor brands, or the competitors if you're a new brand and want to enter the market. It helps to identify product strengths and weaknesses and select the competitors you want to compete against. So to be able to identify where the different brands exist on the different dimensions, and then you can visually determine how much you want to emphasize on what key product attributes, how much you want to change them to be able to have a more favorable position. And it also helps you to determine visually the impact of communication programs on market perception. So essentially to help redesign your marketing, branding, communication strategies. So here's an example of a research study by Kwok and Russell in 2019. They studied the coffee brands and used perceptual mappings. This was using scanner panel data, so it was different because it used the store purchase data to identify how a particular brand called the Maspin could be repositioned by using this perceptual mapping. So that's another example of mapping. So using the perception maps, it helps you to implement your positioning strategies. And when you're doing that, the brands can leverage their certain characteristics. These could be product characteristics like the features, performance, durability, etc. These could be service attributes, for example, your delivery time, as in case of Australia Post, installation, consultation, consumer training, repairs, etc. Personnel, that is the competency of your staff, credibility, courtesy, responsiveness, that you will see mostly for IT companies, which talk about the competency of their staff, their product development, etc. The brand image, symbols, emotion, personality, for example, in luxury products, which want to establish that exclusivity. So there are different ways you can use different factors to implement positioning or reposition your brand. So positioning is not just about clever slogans or just glossy images and those taglines. It is about what the consumers will realistically perceive your product to be. So it's all about creating a perception in the minds of the consumer. It's a one-time activity, and it should appeal to your consumers and make your product look very superior in the minds of your consumers as compared to the competitors. So positioning is a way to live your brand. So with that, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you.